What is poetic love? Poetic love, in a classical sense, is akin to platonic love. However, the notion that we have of platonic love is, for the most part, a caricature of what Plato calls eros. The caricature has it that Plato sought to escape the physical world to embrace a spiritual, beautiful, pure, angelic-like world. He sought to escape this low world of the passions and somewhat became blind to it for the sake of remaining in this world of ethereal forms, beyond the cave in which we mortals abide. But is this what Socrates, Plato's teacher, had in mind? Is this the love that he cherished? An alternative to our fallen love, an alternative that leaves our fallen condition behind. A dream, one might say, that was to re-emerge in Don Quixote de la Mancha. Don Quixote as Cervantes' character, who saw a prostitute and identified her with an angelic deity of sorts. Is this what poetic love is all about? Mistaking what is low for what is high, what is vile for what is noble, blinding oneself to what is earthly for the sake of dreaming of what is heavenly. Poetic love, classical poetic love. We here have an image that points to the nature of poetic love. Classical poetic love, not merely as something static, but as an activity that embraces all facets of our experience. So let us consider what is moving here. What is at stake? What is the dynamics of love in a poetic sense? In ordinary life, we have love as desire, which seeks to fill our emptiness. It is a love of compulsion. I am hungry, I desire something, I want to appropriate it, fill my emptiness. I have a craving. I have a pain. Life is pain, suffering. We want to quench that pain. We need peace. We need to stop the suffering as much as possible. And so we go out and we seek to fill our void. We do not question our void. We simply try to fill it. That void could be understood as a question. We seek to answer that question, even though we have not asked it ourselves. That question is a kind of, well, it's a bad thing for us. We want to efface it. We want to erase it. We want to smother it. We want to silence that question, that void that is within us and that perhaps is us. So we go out and we seek an object that has no will of its own, a form, something that might restore us, our peace, something that might bring us peace, or rather, allow us to sleep. What happens very often when we are quite satisfied? We are lethargic. We wish to go to sleep. At any rate, we do not need to worry about anything because we're satisfied. We have a great ice cream, we have a great meal, and we want to rest at this point. We're not worrying. We had what we sought, and for the time being, we're at rest. Of course, for the time being, because soon we'll wake up and we'll feel probably worse than we were before. At any rate, we'll start craving something again. Oh, I'm hungry now. I woke up. Oh, I have a headache. Oh, I need something else. And so the story goes on until we leave this theater of the world. We're old, we're tired, time to go. We get off stage. We die, as we usually say. And that's life. You try to fill your void throughout the years until you leave. That is essentially a meaningless life. Ultimately, you're serving as food for the earth. You come out of the earth and you're fertilizing the earth when you leave. Or throughout, as a matter of fact. So, in the terms of the likes of Leonardo da Vinci, most people live like cats and dogs. He had nothing against cats and dogs, but Leonardo recognized that there is a more meaningful, more noble way of living, one that the human being as such is called to face, to endure, to live out. So, poetic love is an alternative. Whereas the vile, the Philistine, the vulgate, the plebeian, all right, the non-poet, the barbaric soul, the crude person, seeks to appropriate what is without, outside of himself, to fill his void, and then perhaps even venture into collaborating with others, other light spirits, to build a world in which everybody's collaborating into satisfying this void of ours. Building a world in which we can stop filling our void because there is a kind of machine that does it for us. It just keeps feeding us our void. Trying to fill up our void, but in fact, feeding us just more void. In other words, fetishes, empty things, things that are devoid of life. So it's feeding us void. It's feeding into void, and it's feeding us projections of the void. We project our void onto the world, and then we seek to fill ourselves up with that projection. That's not very great. It won't work. It doesn't work, obviously. If we reflect a bit, we see that no, that doesn't work. So, Of course, we have what, in classical terms, we might call art, poetic art. So what we have is a recognition that the object of desire is not just a lifeless, meaningless, inherently meaningless object that is ready at hand for us to determine what it's worth. Perhaps it's the market that decides what something is worth. So it could be trash, and the market says it's worth a lot because it satisfies the whims of a crowd of people. So there is demand, right? And then there's a supply. So if there's a lot of good stuff and very little demand, then it's not worth anything, even though it's inherently good. Right? What if there were no demand for virtue? Then virtue would mean anything. Wouldn't mean anything, right? What if there were no demand for goodness, but only for vice and garbage? Then beauty, goodness would be out of the window, would be considered officially worthless. Whereas trash, having a great demand, would be considered very valuable. Now, in poetic terms, what we have is a recognition that what we love is alive, that what we love is not just a dead object, the worth of which is determined by external factors, but something that is inherently alive and worthy of love. Now, what will you say that gold and all sorts of tangible objects are inherently worthy of being loved? Are they worthy of being loved? Well, if there's nothing divine in them, if there's nothing really alive about them, well, they are at best a reminder of what is alive. And so we try to bring them to life, to bestow upon them our own life. So children do that all the time. Of course, they animate their toys. Now, as they grow up, hopefully, if they're well raised, they'll start to recognize that what is lovable is what is alive. Of course, in the teenage years, probably we'll have boys that desire, right, a female form, and girls likewise, right, a male form, with its various connotations, of course, in their respective ways. And what is happening here, of course, is that what we desire is something that is recognized as being alive and that reminds us of something that transcends our own emptiness. It reminds us of something precious. It's not just something vain. Now, let's say a leaf or a toy or some kind of a fetish. It's not just something there that I can use, manipulate. No, it's something that is active, or at any rate, that reminds us of something that is active, of an activity, something that is alive, inherently meaningful. And it's other with respect to us. It's other, the respect that it is not the same thing that I see in the mirror. So if I'm a young man, I look in the mirror, I say, well, okay, I'm used to that. But if I see a girl with the various connotations, the way of the girl, right? It's something strange for me, something that I think, oh, maybe that'll not so much just fill my void as food would, but it might complement me so that I may regain a fullness of life. And so here I recognize that I'm not altogether empty, but my life is not fulfilled. My life is not complete. So I need to complete my life. I don't start from scratch, tabula rasa, and just look at res extensa out there, as Descartes will invite us to do. I'm trying to complete something that is halfway there, so to speak. Perhaps I'm fallen as a human being, but my fallenness is not a complete fall. I still have an element of life that needs to be, that begs to be, that asks to be, that desires to be fulfilled. And so I go for the other half. Now, the other half, therefore, reminds me of completion, of a complete life. Now, as it so happens, this other half becomes a big problem, because the other half, of course, when it comes together with the first half, has a hard time holding itself together with the other half. So the two halves have a hard time fitting together. Right? For one thing, there's an outside world which impinges upon this unity, this attempted unity. Another problem is that the two halves disappear to each other when they're together, united, when they touch each other. As long as there's a distance between the two, there's desire. But the desire ends when the two come together. There's a kind of satisfaction, but the satisfaction is, again, subject to being destroyed by the outside world. And on top of that, it obscures its own meaning. We don't really think, we don't desire, we don't reflect in the act of being, in the moment of being satisfied. So we need a distance between the two. So now, poetry, classical poetry, responds to this problem by seeing the poetic form, right, typically referred to as, most notably, as a muse, the poetic form, as standing necessarily at a distance from the poet. What is more, this poetic form is not just there statically, it is calling, it has an agency on the poet. It is guiding the poet. Where is it guiding the poet to? Well, the poet begins to see in this poetic form the fullness of life itself. The poetic form is not just there to complement the other half, as in this myth that is told in Plato's Symposium, where a poet speaks of an age where people were complete and then they were split into two. So there's the male is half a sphere and the female half the sphere, and then they try to get back together again. What happens here is that the unity is not identified with myself, with the other, or with the two coming together, but with a long-lost reality, right? That cannot be returned to simply by bringing the two halves together. Right? That would be somewhat of a joke. How, then, are we to return to that original unity of life? Well, desire, poetic love is the key. So what happens is that the poet begins to see all forms through the muse, through the poetic form par excellence, paradigmatic form, let's say the muse, begins to see all forms as reflections of an original unity of life. This original unity of life, as the poet exercises his art, comes forth for the poet as the primal mover of the poet himself, of the poet's love. The poet's love for a poetic form, for an outside form, emerges as called for, as produced somehow by the original unity of life. Dante Alighieri, in his comedy, in his Inferno, has a verse that is all about this. Amor che nulla amato amar perdona. Love is divine love that does not forgive the beloved for loving. This is a cryptic verse that has three senses of love. Love as the divine love, substantive, divine, God, a person. We could say eros as a god. That does not forgive the amato, so amore, amato, amare. The beloved. The amare as a verb, the loving. All right, so what does Dante mean here? The proper object of love, the full object of love, what we really ultimately love, is love itself as a god. Now, in Platonic terms, love is still eros, is not a god yet. And that has some reasons. But in this case, love stands as the God of love, the God of the universe, the God that moves the stars. All right. This God does not forgive the object of love. Why not? Well, in the story that is told by Dante, Paolo and Francesca, this is a story. Francesca and Paolo kiss in their ordinary life by reading a book. We won't get into details here, but the point is they kiss and they're punished for this. Their lips meet, and in other words, they lose that distance between the two of them. So what happens is that they're punished by being stuck together for eternity. Right? So what we have here is, of course, a caricature of a problem that we have in ordinary life. We lose distance. And so we lose poetry. And so we lose understanding. We lose a way of life. And we fall back into pain and suffering. And we're victims in this world at that point. Now, where this distance is maintained, we begin to recognize that the form of love is not just a static thing, as we noted, but it's also an agent. That, in other words, it's not ultimately that we have a lover and a beloved, but that the beloved is at work in the lover, modifying him, maturing him, purging him of his limitations. So the beloved has demands on the lover. Of course, we see this in very down-to-earth terms, where we have, let's say, a very important man, powerful, and he desires a young woman, and this woman comes up to him, docile and apparently harmless, right, and defenseless. And yet she has great power over him. Right? He cannot harm her, otherwise she'll spoil his jewel. And he wants to please her because he wants to show that she recognizes his greatness. Right? So he wants to give her things so that she'll be attached to him more and more, not just apparently, but really within, because otherwise, she might wake up in the morning or in the middle of the night and stab him to death. So he wants to be able to trust her, to have her under his empire. How does he do that? By catering to her whims, ultimately. So what happens here, of course, is that defenseless weakling of a girl has great power over this lord, apparently powerful lord. In fact, manages to pull some strings. She becomes more and more cunning, and she's able to define his courses of action. So she becomes the master. And how many stories have been written about this sort of scenario? Well, but in the case of the muse, she's good. She's not a cunning person, and the lover is not a brute. So what we have is that the poetic form is purging the lover of all of his compulsions, of all fear, of his attachments to attachment, to compulsion and so forth, to the earthly world. Now, what happens here? Does he become blind to the world of objects? No. He recognizes it for what it is, in its own nature, in its own place, in its proper place, which is to say, an image, a mirror of a reality that the poet has lost, that he seeks, a fullness of being, a fullness of life. So the muse becomes a paradigm for everything, all forms of everyday life. When I see the bread, I do not see merely a piece of material. I see God in it. When I eat it, I am not merely eating material, ingesting it to fill my emptiness. I am bringing the sign of the divine within me, and thereupon the divine is born within me through the understanding, through reflection. So the poetic life is really a life of purgation and reflection. Now, the poetic form, which is to say all forms, are understood as mirrors of their source, the form of all forms. The form of all forms is at once the primary agent, the one that moves me, moves the poet to desire, moves the human being, moves our being to seek itself, to return to what we in our fallen condition have, to some extent at least, lost, forgotten. And so we seek to remember what we have lost. We go out and we assume rather, that we're tempted to, or we're compelled to assume that the form of desire, that which completes us, is just inanimate. And so we can just grab it. And then we move forward and recognize, no, there's something alive here that will help us. And then we have a hard time figuring out how to deal with this, which is alive. And finally, the poet says, well, or the awakened poet, shall we say, because we're all poets, but the awakened one will recognize there's this paradigm of forms, right? The muse. And this paradigm is a mirror, not an opaque object, but a translucent one. It's one that can reflect the source of our very desire. And so now we begin to see that the source of our desire, which is the primary actor here, right, flows through our desire and animates the object, the form, to educate us. So that the muse is really endowed with the agency of the source of our desire, which is bringing us back to itself through the poetic form. We're being awakened to the source of our desire, which is eminently alive, eminently active, right? Providentially active in our own poetic activity. The ancients speak of the source in various ways, and traditionally we speak of God, of course, the form of the good, the idea of the good in itself, in and of itself, that which we ultimately desire, to speak in Platonic terms. Again, in Aristotle, we find the nous poietikos, the active intellect, as the medievals translated it, intellectus agens. So this creative, productive mind, nous, thought that is at work. It's an activity that is at work in our own life to bring us back to it. And within it, we find ultimate fulfillment. Does that mean that everything else is left behind? No, everything else was just a sign of that fulfillment. And so what do? We escape this world, the earthly world. Well, as long as we're here, we establish this relationship. We're called to be within this relationship, to partake in the divine by engaging in the world, by recognizing the signs of the divine, and by responding to the divine by heeding those signs. Heeding the signs is to say, well, to establish a proper relationship with those signs, with the forms of our ordinary life. And the basest of senses, right? We are to seek moderation in our relationship with, so the relationship between our desire, or desire itself, and forms. But this moderation is there for the sake of something immoderate, namely an immoderate return to the good itself. This is the poetic life. It is a life that we live in harmony with the source of all life. A life that is in this world, but ultimately, of course, does not belong to it.